Okay, so we're reviewing the Sunday papers. We have in studio Declan Lynch from the Sunday Independent and Cliona Foley, who presents a podcast here on News Talk with Off the Ball. Off the Bench is the name of the podcast, and freelance journalist, including every Monday with the Irish Independent. So the front pages are all about James McCarthy, unfortunately. The pictures are fairly gruesome. If you're of a sensitive disposition, avoid the back page of the Sunday World. They've a picture of mid-break, McCart break. James faces a year out after horror. Double leg snap is their headline. Sunday Mirror have McCarthy's horror break. They also have Heir of the Pog. So Paul Pogba will demand his wages are doubled to match £400,000 a week recruit Alexis Sanchez. Sunday Independent have McCarthy faces long road back. They also have Cullen, as in Leo, delighted as Blues seal top seed status. The title then go with James McCarthy. McCarthy suffers horror break, double fracture set to rule the Irish international out for a year. The Sunday Times, their main picture is Sean Cronin, who's celebrating his try beside Jameson Gibson Park. The headline is "In Full Cry, 6 wins out of 6 make Leinster top seeds for European quarter-finals." And beneath that, they have Republic's McCarthy suffers double leg break. And beneath that, the Sunday Times have an interesting story, which is that Spurs fight for €230 million cane. So Real Madrid, according to Jonathan Northcroft, are prepared to pay €230 million for Harry Kane. The current record is 225 for Neymar to PSG. And Daniel Levy, we read, is trying to warn them off. One of the contexts they include is that the stadium costs for Spurs have gone from €450 million to €850 million, which is quite the jump, and they potentially have no Champions League football next season, so finances are tight. The Sun have James leg break agony. Again, that, of course, is James McCarthy, and the Observer have a picture of Sergio Aguero saying treble top hat-trick hero Aguero keeps Guardiola's pace-setting City rolling. It's quite the tongue twister. So, James McCarthy, did you see the incident? Did you watch Match of the Day last night or avoid it?
I actually avoided it, yeah. It sounded so horrendous, and I haven't looked at the back page on the Sunday World. You just really feel, I was just saying to...
I'll show you here.
No. Yeah. And I'm not normally that squeamish, but it's just, he's had such a terrible run of bad luck.
Yeah.
And also just saying to Declan outside, like, you know, the whole last week we spent talking about, you know, Martin O'Neill, and, you know, we talk about, you know, all of the millions the players make, and then you see something like that, and it's really the reality for so many professional footballers. They're not at that level where they're making, you know, whatever it is, Sanchez 400,000 a week, and you just really feel for the guy. And yeah, just for once, I just said no. I don't think I need to see that.
Yeah, I didn't either. Match of the Day, if you didn't catch it, they showed the replay, but it paused the footage just as Foot was about to make impact with the back of McCarthy's leg, and I mean, it was fairly obvious in the what happens next caption what was going to happen, but they didn't actually show it. Yeah, which was maybe the right thing to do. And if you're of a certain disposition, you can go on Twitter very quickly and find it.
Yeah, no, I didn't see it either. If this is a kind of a reflection of the broader population, nobody has seen this, you know.
Or one maybe wants to see it.
Yeah.
A double compound fracture.
I think after Sheamus Coleman, a lot of people thought, you know what, I don't want to see this anymore. That was maybe where I said, I've had enough of seeing it.
Yeah, we used to see this. I remember one of the first ones was Henrik Larsson.
I was going to ask you, that's the first one in my childhood. Yeah. That was the first awareness, really, that this could happen. Yeah. You know, that a compound fracture looked like that. It was a right angle. So pre-Larsson, I was funny you brought that up. I was going to say pre-Henrik Larsson, I presume this happened just as frequently once every 2 or 3 years, no?
Yeah. Well, I'm sure it did. We just didn't see the picture of it.
Yeah.
You know, that's my first memory of actually seeing someone's leg, part of it sticking out. You know, the wrong way. So it's just one of these odd things, like some of these injuries that never existed before, and suddenly you see them. Metatarsals. Where is the metatarsal gone?
I know. It was David Beckham.
Nobody has them anymore. It seems
very much involved.
No, you definitely have them, Declan.
But
you just haven't injured them.
The media are no longer interested in them.
They're not as fashionable, I suppose. Yeah. So we wish him well. It's a year out, which is a staggering amount of time. Like when they cut to Sheamus Coleman in the stand, it had more than a degree of poignancy, and he
who I think who got up, and the intimation was that he was going down to talk to him. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Well, I suppose if you're McCarthy, you must be in a state of shock, and Coleman will know what you're going through, so maybe he can just tell you to focus on your breathing. There's not much you can do. You're just you're kind of screwed. It's an awful one.
Yeah, you're kind of curious going way back, like, you know, when people had cruciate injuries, they would, like, say, Brian Clough, I think, had a cruciate, which kind of ended his career.
That's
like,
right, yeah.
You wonder how they actually treated these things way back. Presumably, players had these double breaks. Dave Mackay, for example, who seemed to break his leg quite a lot. Is that what happened with him? I'm not sure, but I guess it must have been. You know, and how did they rebuild them back then? I don't know. It must have been pretty scary. I mean, now within 20 seconds they have a team of paramedics around them and all that
oxygen,
stuff. You know?
everything.
Yeah. Well, we'll see how he goes. So you just wanted to mention as well, I mean, I noted there in the headlines that Paul Pogba is looking over at Alexis Sanchez getting 400 grand a week and has said, well, you can now double my wages. I mean, we'll put that under the category of first world problems. But there
was a lot of this stuff.
Is it 350? Is it 350 with tax, I think? Maybe.
Is that okay?
I think that might
Netto.
be it.
There's another thing that's gone out. Remember a few years ago, everything was netto. That if you would get 100,000 a week after tax, and they called it netto. I remember Lauro once explaining this in great that it's all netto now. Right. And again, nobody speaks of it anymore. Although we kind of almost assume it now that it has to be netto. I mean, these agents couldn't possibly be contemplating, paying tax to Her Majesty's government or whatever. So there was quite a bit about this stuff in the papers today. I was reading Kevin Kilban on the move, Sanchez moving to City. The killer always makes a lot of sense here, and he's pointing out that De Bruyne is getting 150 grand a week. I genuinely felt for him when, for a moment, I had the authentic feeling, God, that guy, they're really doing the guy, aren't they? They're paying Sanchez 450 grand and 150 grand a week. They can insult the man with this.
on the basis of how well he plays, yes.
Look at all he did. Even last
really
night, and after all that, he comes in and they say, and you're only getting 150 grand a week this week as well, mate.
So you genuinely felt
there was a genuine moment when I was kind of taken aback.
And then you went, it's a week, not a month, it's a week.
yeah. So how are they getting away with paying Kevin De Bruyne 150 grand a week?
No, not for long, I think, is the short answer.
I mean, they'll talk about it in future the way they talk about Wilf Mannion now in Middlesbrough getting 18 quid a week and 75,000 people in the stands. I mean, they will consider it a scandal of this magnitude.
Yes, I'm sure. So there's a fair degree of nostalgia. I mean, there's a theme, there were a few pieces that you both liked.
It's actually funny you're talking about payment, because weren't you looking at the Cyril Regis payment as well, Declan?
Yeah, there's a piece by Martin Joel, I think in the Sunday Times.
Yeah,
about,
Sunday Times,
page 7 there.
Yeah, he was a teammate of Cyril Regis. Now, the bit that comes out of it, first of all, is the fact that everyone was on 500 quid a week, apart from Cyril, who was on 900. So this was a measure of his greatness. Now, you do kind of. I mean, this is it's impossible to position yourself kind of ethically on this, right? Clearly, footballers were ripped off hugely for decades, forever, right? This is even like Cyril on 900 quid a week on super wages, right? He's on like Alexis Sanchez type wages. 900 quid a week when, even in the Hawthorns, you would have had like full houses, loads and loads and loads of money coming in the turnstiles every week, and giving Cyril 900 quid, So it swung so much in the other direction that, you wonder, could they not just get something in the middle? Is it be totally beyond the powers of human negotiation to figure out, does it have to be one extreme? Does somebody always have to be ripped off? Do
you see the 1990s as a fair period in time?
That may be the golden age. No, it was still, I mean, the thing that always struck me about that era was Tony Cascarino, who, when he played for Ireland, I remember seeing some article about it, that he kind of needed the money. He would get whatever he got for playing for Ireland. But at the time, he sort of needed the extra few quid.
His match appearance fee.
Whatever, yeah. I mean, can you imagine that? There's such a thing happening now that someone actually, it's a bit of an earner.
I think they generally give them to charity in a lot of cases as well. You know, I think
Yeah.
that I think like
I know I would. I'd certainly.
Yes, and no,
I
I
give
know
most
that.
of my wages to charity. Anyway.
That's that piece actually. I liked that piece, but we were just saying how there are mixed values in that piece as well. We were talking about nostalgia. There's quite a lot of nostalgic pieces in papers today.
Yeah.
For some reason, Martin Jol talks about it, and he says that Regis became a born again Christian, but that was later. When he was younger, he was, how can I put it, a bit more outgoing.
Yeah, it's a good
he
line.
talks about him going out and the boys out clubbing until all hours and still coming in and the amount of goals he could score. But there is a line in it which is he trots out that line about Ron Atkinson not being racist, and that Cyril never thought he was racist, I think there's a very good piece by...
I'll just read the quote so y'all see if people get a flavour of it. For example, with Ron Atkinson, Ron was not a racist, says y'all, 100% not. But he said something stupid on television and Cyril smiled about it. We thought he must be angry, but he said no, he wasn't angry. He knew Ron was not a racist. Interestingly, we had Brennan Batson on the show during the week, who was very angry about the Ron Atkinson comment about Desai at that time.
Yeah. And Eamon Sweeney talks about it actually in his piece about Cyril Regis today as well. And I think it's a very good piece because there was a lot of talk about that during the week and about, those were the days and you could call the boys the 3 degrees and, there was no racism intended. While at the same time balancing that out with the amount of blatant racism that they had to sustain. And I like his piece because he points out that, none of, because Cyril Regis said he wasn't a racist, didn't mean that Ron Atkinson, and he actually uses the phrase that he used famously about Desi, which I don't even want to repeat, to be honest.
Joel actually says that Cyril forgave people all the time, right? Now there was actually a fair bit to forgive here, I think. He also goes on to say that people were a bit racist in those days. They were a bit racist. Now, Eamon Sweeney actually quotes one of this a bit racism lines in the Shoot annual. The great
unbelievable. Just shocking stuff.
There was a feature on Cyril Regis, Laurie Cunningham, and Brendan Batson. And I'll just quote what Eamon writes here. I started to read it, and the very first sentence of the piece was a question. Name 6 players who've played for West Brom and whose names end in O. Then it gave the answer. Len Cantello, Joe Mayo, Ken Foggo, and 3 Sambos. It's really extraordinary.
In the next line, the writer told us that when Regis got kicked, it took the physio half an hour to find the bruise. He assured us West Brom's black players thought these jokes were funny, and just now when you look at that stuff, it is, and we all had Scorcher and Score or whatever. My brothers used to get it, we used to lap it up, and you just think of the culture and the way people thought then. And I mean, Eamon takes it then, as he often does in his good pieces, to its current conclusion. And he says, he points out that in the league, there's 92 managers, only 5 of them have black managers. And he talks about Chris Powell, who was the manager of the year in League One in 2012, who doesn't have a job at the moment, and also mentions about inexplicable stacking of Chris Hughton, obviously. He's saying, and they're not talking about compulsory appointments. If you had the notion of bringing in a quota system in for black managers in England, he's saying you would be just talking about compulsory interviewing.
That's the Rooney Rule, effectively.
Yeah, the Rooney Rule, which is what Dan Rooney did in America, with the NFL. So it is really interesting sometimes when you see nostalgia, you have to look at it very carefully and see what it really meant.
I like that he pointed out remembering the 84 FA Cup semi-final, that famous one with John Barnes, where he was abused all the way through. But he says it wasn't just an English thing. In 1985, Derry City visited the showgrounds to play Sligo Rovers. There were 2 black players on the visiting team, Nelson De Silva and Owen De Gama, who every time they got on the ball were assailed by a chorus of monkey chants. A large group of supporters were involved and they put enormous feeling into it. They seemed motivated by genuine hatred. How much worse it must have been for the first black players during the 70s, an era when the National Front still enjoyed a significant presence on English streets and racism was even more rife. Yeah, I mean... And
Eamon is qualified to talk about that. He's booked a bit of read about Sligo Rovers. Is a really good read, He was...
Because Batson, during the show, during the week rather, on the show, was saying that he was actually Arsenal's first ever black player.
Yeah, I heard the interview.
1974. So really the Cyril Regis and Batson and Laurie Cunningham and Viv Anderson, I mean, there were literally no black players before the 70s. in English football.
Well, John
so they were the
Giles
first.
signed Laurie Cunningham.
Right.
It was through, I think, Ronnie Allen, who went on to be West Brom manager. He scouted Laurie Cunningham and Cyril Regis, but he brought John Giles down to see Laurie Cunningham. He was brilliant, you know. And I remember when I was working on the book with Giles, he was recalling that whole thing about black players, that the kind of idea in the game at the time was that they lacked bottle, right? That was the kind of notion. And Giles, with his wondrous logic, was saying, well, no, you got Pele there, right? And you got Jerzino, and they don't lack much bottle, do they? No bottle whatsoever lacking there, right? And, based on this simple deduction, he was able to free himself of this, and see that Laurie Cunningham was a fantastic player, and he finished up, being sold to Real Madrid for $1 million or something.
Died tragically young in a car crash in Monaco.
That's right, yeah.
Yeah, because even Batson was remembering there was a famous game at Old Trafford where West Brom, the 5-3 game in December, because another line was that black players couldn't play in the cold. All this stuff floating around.
Oh, and Martin Giles' piece, he talks actually about how hard Cyril Regis was as a player, how phenomenally strong and tough he was, and how he broke his jaw in a match one day, and he literally he was still smiling afterwards as his face swelled. So it is interesting. I think there has been a lot of nostalgia and a lot of talk this week, and it didn't, I think, highlight, because Regis obviously was such a laid back character and had that ability to smile through horrendous stuff. It didn't focus. I thought Keith Duggan had a column in the Irish Times yesterday, and he made a really good point. And he said the people who were abusing those players in those years are now still on the terraces and probably fathers. And wouldn't it be really interesting now, as they look at the multicoloured nature of the Premiership and English football, to wonder what are they thinking now and how do they feel about what they did then?
I hadn't given that much thought before. It's a good point. Certainly Sweeney is outraged that Big Ron was the go-to man last week as the guy to pay tribute to Cyril. Martin Yall, I was quite an athlete then. I feel like Martin Yall's an arrogant man in a very likeable way. He's a healthy amount of confidence. I was quite the athlete then. I was 76 kgs, but then Cyril came in. I'd never seen anything like it. Six-pack, unbelievable arms, muscular as if he worked out every day. He had a relaxed, slow walk like a cowboy. He was the strongest player I'd ever seen. I was talking to my missus about him, and she said, but he's not as big as you. But bloody hell, I thought he was bigger than me. He was in my mind. He had such charisma. He looked like the best-looking actor in Hollywood, like The Rock or something. The Rock being Martin Yall's high watermark. And when Cyril smiled, it was unbelievable. The kind of guy who, when they enter a room, everybody stops. Does that tally with your memory, Cyril, or was it? Can you remember?
Yeah, well, they're very distant memories now. But I just have this mental image of him, barreling through the centre of the field, trying to score goals at all times.
And,
you know what I mean?
And that kind of exuberant player as well, it's
just great energy, great sort of directness, and just a brilliant player, really. I mean, the West Brom hadn't, they'd had some success, I suppose, in the late 60s, but they were not much until, and then suddenly this team arrived, and they were really exciting team.
If you want to just finish off on the footballing nostalgia, page 48 of the title, Philip Quinn's done an interview with Bill Darby, who I hadn't really heard of Bill Darby before, but spent 44 years as the Arsenal scout. That famous picture, that black and white famous picture of the four Dubs, Brady and Stapleton and O'Leary and of course Johnny Murphy. And that remember that documentary? It was such a brilliant title. Who's that standing beside Johnny Murphy?
There's a great headline on this piece as well, which is "Sharp Eye for a Gunner." Actually, kudos to this sub who put that one up. There's a great photo. There's a really lovely photo of the Arsenal team. Sometimes you love these nostalgic pieces, and this is just a really nice. And there's a gorgeous photo of him holding that photo of the four boys as well. But the one that cracked me up with this is he asked him also about players, that got away, if you like. And his line on Damien Duff cracked me up, and he said I looked at him one day playing for Lourdes Celtic. He was very fragile, and I thought, he can't run.
This is a football man, what you would call.
This is a football man. When Eamon Dunphy is arguing on behalf of
real football
of a football man, it's Bill Darby he has in mind.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's all these things like, he'd get a bonus when they made the first team, and he'd get another bonus if they became an international. Again, we think of the agents of today, and what they now. I suspect that Bill Darby is a deeply happy man as he looks back over his career, and always like there are the ones that got away. He says that the best player of all was Kwame Ampadu.
Yeah, more skillful than Brady.
Yeah. He somehow didn't quite make it as he should have done. But Andy Reid, he says when he was playing an under-13 match, he invited the scout, what's his name, Rowley, I think.
Steve Rowley.
Steve Rowley.
Yeah.
Rowley.
He invited him over, and Steve Rowley asked for a seat to sit in the sun while he was watching the match, and fell asleep at the points where Andy was scoring.
Well, as Darby says,
goals.
Reid got a goal like you'd see the Brazilian score.
Yeah.
When it was over, I went down to Rowley and he was asleep. He wakes up and asks, "Is there extra time?" I said, "Reid's after scoring one of the great goals and you're asleep."
Yeah.
So that was how Andy Reid missed out on a move to Arsenal.
It's a lovely piece.
Quinn writes that over the course of a 90-minute chat, he hardly draws breath as he recalls the players he sent over to Arsenal during his 44 years as the scout. He's almost 92 years old now. Attended his first FAI Cup final in 1939 when Shelburne beat Sligo Rovers after a replay. Sligo had Dixie Dean, he says.
And he managed in the League of Ireland as well.
Aye.
And obviously out in the hall is an assortment of Russian hats, which was his trademark apparel for standing around pitches in all weathers.
Yeah.
It's a lovely image, isn't it?
It is, yeah.
Yeah, he never learned how to drive either. So he tells us that Joe Haverty, former international, he used to drive him everywhere. So you have Joe Haverty driving around, but Joe couldn't drive on the south side, didn't know anything about the south side. So they get into a bit of trouble once they crossed O'Connell Bridge. But it's a great image of football men. This was how they lived, and it's wonderful.
But even how it happened, it's amazing how quickly football has changed really in such a short space of time. Like he was managing, as you said, Longford, Cliona and Drogheda, and people said, well, you should go over and test yourself. So he went over to see if he could find work as a scout. He went to Chelsea. Dave Sexton, the manager, says, well, I have someone in Ireland. So he goes down the road to Spurs.
Yeah.
There seems to be just no one there because it's summertime, which is such a quaint thought now. And then he wanders over to Highbury and he gets a look around and he becomes the Arsenal guy in Ireland. And that's just kind of how it happens. Of Johnny Murphy, that fourth guy in the picture with Stapleton, Brady and OLeary, he says, Philip Quinn asked him, could Johnny have made it? Johnny was a smashing player, ferocious shot. He would have made the first team because he was so strong. Johnny Murphy came home due to homesickness was the reason. And then the classic, you should have seen his brother moment, which is in every Irish family, of Dave OLeary. He felt Pearce, his brother, was a better player than Dave. He said one player he'd no doubts over was Niall Quinn. Kind of an interesting one. I'd say a lot of people would have looked at Niall Quinn and had big doubts over him, but he liked Quinn. So
you mentioned there the sub, you're paying tribute to the subs. I think the little mention as well in the Kevin Kilban column, he's on about Arsene Wenger and kind of how he needs to go. And it says here, it is time for him to go, and hammering in a few goals against Crystal Palace yesterday doesn't change that. Clearly, you see that they scored 4 in the first
25 minutes. Yeah.
So clearly some, sharp-eyed subs out that we just mentioned that just to give the
Roy Curtis has a nice piece in the Sunday World today actually about Wenger. It's just very well written, and he has one of his opening lines is he says he's like he's hanging on like a roomy-eyed bar soak, oblivious to the fact that the closing time light is on. It's a really well written piece actually. It's well worth a read.
He in recent weeks, Roy Curtis, has been coming out with some classic lines.
Yeah, that is a particularly good piece. Yeah.
So if you're sticking to our little nostalgic theme, Joe Brolly's feeling very nostalgic. He was at a funeral during the week of a teammate of his father's.
Of his dad's,
they would have played
right.
hurling in Dungiven.
Yeah.
And I mean, again, like
Raleigh's really
got
really
turn of
good.
phrase.
He's got a beautiful turn of phrase, and he seems to have an encyclopedic memory of incidents and matches and stuff that happened in his dad's day. So it is actually a really nice piece. Now, the bone of contention, I suppose, and Brawley always has a little stinger at the end, is that he's given out about the fact that there's so much science in the game now, and that people just, it's overly manned by professionals trying to coach the game, and so the headline is "Scientific Gobbledygook is filling the gap where practice practicing skills used to be. And that angle comes up actually in a few articles this week. Colin O'Rourke is talking about it. There's quite a few people in the Indo, because you remember the free taking shootout last weekend in the football match where there was only 3 scored out of 10, and actually in the Walsh Cup yesterday with Wexford, that came down to a penalty shootout, and that's very well a free taken from the 65. It's very well covered today as well. Wexford beat Kilkenny last night 3-2, and apparently if you get to see it, there's a full coverage of the match. I got it online this morning because Wexford GA have it filmed, and there's commentary on it, and it is absolutely classic. Right. I really recommend people go and see it. It's absolutely brilliant done. Michael Dwyer is doing the commentary, and Ronan Fagan, a local journalist, is doing it, and it's just the best. It's really excellent. It's well worth going to see. But even James O'Connor in the Indo today has been a bit nostalgic about this new order and the problems it's going to cause for the GA.
Anything in particular, Jamesy?
Well, he's just saying about the fixtures, and like it's sort of I suppose it's an early preview into the league starting next week. But he's just talking about it's you've now condensed the league into such a short time, and he's sceptical as well. I think about this thing of notion of people being able to play club games in April as well. He's kind of saying
Oh well, I mean that's just not going to happen. Really,
yeah, exactly. But Joe, that's kind of Joe's angle, if you like, on that one is that the old days, but some of the stuff in it is pretty good. All right, it's well worth the read as well. His dad's nose, I think, was it his dad's nose got broken by his own team's goalie? Yeah, exactly. And when the goalie hit him, he said, "Jesus, Francie, what the hell were you doing in here?" That was as close an apology he ever gave to.
Yeah, because he says my father
he died this week. This goalie.
My father was the only cultured member of that Dungiven defence. He played centre half back and was simply too handsome to wear a helmet.
Yeah, it's a great line. And this goalie who died this week, Billy Taylor, he was the goalie, and he had to be approached with extreme caution, he says, in the manner of David Attenborough nearing a silverback gorilla.
Sudden movements tended to panic him, which manifested itself in hard, high pulling towards the threat until it was subdued. The rule was that anything that came into the general area of the square was Billy's. And so Brawley's dad wandered back there and got a hurl in the head. Billy, who tragically died this week, was a great fellow. Hurled for us until he was well into his 40s, loved every minute of it. He was an independent spirit on and off the field. His party piece was that he could sing Sean South to the tune of The Sash, and vice versa, with my father accompanying him on guitar. In this regard, Billy must be recognised as one of the earliest public advocates of peace between the loyalist and the Republican. And so the funeral was this week, and Raleigh arrived, and he saw one of the players, Liam Hinfey, who was cornerback, and he was standing at the back of the chapel. Well, he was standing at the back of the chapel, and Bradley writes, Liam reminds me of the Dunbelievable's great joke that if you didn't get down to Mass early enough, you had to sit.
There's a nice piece as well, Dermot Crowe, just on that nostalgic thing, in the Sunday Independent as well, and it's about media scrutiny and media relations with the GA, and that's sort of been a bit of a topic this week, I think, in terms of, coverage of the Grobler story and the media's coverage of it. But there's a brilliant photo alone. The photo alone is worth having a look at, because it's the press box in Haggardstown in Louth, and it's pictured in 2014, and it has a ladder going up to it, and the guys are at the top. But I actually thought it was the old press box in Aughrim, which was exactly the same. It was a sort of Rapunzel thing where you had to take a ladder up because the door was at the top of it. And I was in it one day, and the kids at half time for the crack took away the ladder, so we were stuck in it. So Joe, you're in here with this lovely cushy job. You're not out there in Aughrim up a ladder somewhere. But that's a really good piece actually about the fact that media relations in the GA and access to players, there's been problems before. It goes back to way before, and he talks about other instances, and back to Tip. I think Tip and Wexford, a league situation in the early 90s, and they banned people from, they banned the press as well. So it's not a local thing, as I said, but there's some great lines in it. Again, it's just a really nice nostalgic piece, and it's kind of tongue-in-cheek as well. On
Brawley's core point, by the way, that the skills have now diminished in the modern era because they're training 5-6 nights a week. Like, he's making the point that if you're being flogged 5-6 nights a week, you don't, maybe in comparison with back in the day, in contrast to back in the day, you don't have the time to go to a pitch and just have that lovely simple feeling of kicking a ball over the bar and working on your skills. You're just being flogged by S&C coaches. So the game is not as skillful. And he mentioned that shootout last week as an example of that.
Yeah, and people like Bernard Flynn, he was saying in his day, you would stop during his work day and stop somewhere and go in and practice. Yeah,
like the number of GA players who are in here who talk about going to a pitch on their own to practice their shooting and their kicking is almost absolute. Like, it was just a theme last year.
They do it.
Yeah, they do it all the time.
We just don't know they do it.
Yeah, but any of them that were in here, there was a period where it came up, and Gainey from Kerry was in saying how he would just go to a field and beat imaginary defenders. And
Paul Gainey, yeah.
Yeah. But then I thought, God, that was very interesting. And other players that came in, I said, Paul Gainey was in last week. He said this. Do you do that?
Yeah, you find loads of them.
To a man, they all do.
Yeah, the Killian O'Connors of this world, they all do it. They all find time to do it.
All on the pitch kicking.
Yeah.
And also that the skills have diminished. Like, look, I don't know. You don't want to be disrespectful of any time, but I watch as many of those games from the 70s, the heralded games, as any. I lived through the 90s. You occasionally catch those games. I think the skills have never been better. That's my personal opinion. I've watched the kicking.
Yeah, I think his point, and it crops up a lot in Gaelic football particularly, is people are they kind of a bit sick of the hand passing and the fact that you do see players a lot in nowadays. You see particularly some backs and even midfielders where, they get within shooting range and then they immediately seem to look for somebody to hand the ball off. And I think that kind of annoys purists who think, why can't you score from there? So that instant last week where Meath shot 2 and was it Loud shot 1 or whatever in that free taking competition, it was being kind of used now to hammer them, say, they can't kick the ball from that distance. The light was terrible for a start. It was a horrible night, and it was the same yesterday with the free shooting in the hurling. The conditions were awful and it was a nasty thing. I think that overuse of hand passing has been used really as a stick to beat people, to say they're not skillful.
Yeah.
They probably, as you say, they're the speed, the pace, some of the scoring is even better, I think, than ever before.
Yeah.
But it's this stick that's being used to beat, because the games have changed tactically.
There's a sense that they're being too regimented, that someone will be in a better position than somebody else, but because he'll be under an instruction that he's not to kick the ball.
There'd be a bit of that for sure. I'd accept some of that going on.
Clearly, this is something on which I have thought deeply, and it's kind of a bit linked. The idea of, there's a couple of pieces about Dublin and whether to abolish Dublin, basically, and if that's how that's affecting the overall game, right? And if you think about it, right, you've got all these...
Not to abolish Dublin, split Dublin.
Yeah, right, okay, as it is.
Freudian slip.
Spoken like a Westmeath there.
Like,
if you want to make the case for abolishing Dublin, it's a separate show.
Okay. I'll draft a memorandum to that effect. But if you are, say, in one of the so-called weaker counties, if you're being told that you're going to have to train like 6 nights a week, you will have no life for the next 4 years, and you will have basically no chance of winning anything ever. I do actually hear of situations. My ear is not completely to the ground on this, but I do hear the odd person saying this, that very, very good, potentially good players in the so-called weaker counties are just discouraged by the fact that too much is demanded of them for too little immediate results. Yeah. Because the bigger Dublin have established this utter dominance, and just generally, if you are in a weak position, it's so much harder now to get out of it. Apparently, So there's a kind of a structural issue of some kind.
And that echoes a piece by, is it Mark O'Shea today in the Mail as well,
Page
about
54.
About drink bans. He actually makes exactly that point, Declan. That he admits, he says, when I was playing for Kerry, the chances were, all of the sacrifice was worth it. We were always going to be thereabouts, and he appreciates the fact that players in weaker counties, have their nose pressed to the glass, looking and thinking, "What the hell am I doing this for?" And because Kieran Bergen has come out about the drink bans, Tipperary player, Brendan Bugler this week, Joe, was very strong as well. As I don't know if you saw his piece about why he retired from Clare hurling.
33.
Just couldn't give the commitment. Has a child, feels it's too regimented. Again, why can't we do stuff at home that we were brought in to do? So it does continue with that theme, all right. But Mark O'Shea's, it's a good piece. His columns are always witty as well, and he talks about the first one to introduce the drink ban, I think, or Jack O'Connor brought in a nutritionist, and how the boys
they had to fill out a form.
Yeah, they had to fill out a form, and he says Tom O'Sullivan, one eye in mischief and the other probably on truth, informed Kevin, this was the nutritionist, I think, that that the previous Saturday night he had a quarter pounder with all the trimmings and curry chips, with his appetite having been sauced by a gallon of beer. Jack, mortified when this was presented to him as something less than best practice, admonished Tom the next training session, saying, "Tom, you effing hey dog, I told you to be honest, but I didn't tell you to be that honest." But he's saying, and I think it's a point, this is a point I always wonder about, and players do say it to you, is like, and he says it here, like if you're an inter-county managing and you're managing senior players and they're training as hard as they are and they're as committed as they are, you don't really need a drinks ban.
No.
Like, doesn't he say that here?
Yeah, the reality is that if you're serious about your game, you're never going to abuse yourself in that way. But going for a couple of pints with your friends is a way of unwinding. It's kind of hard to argue with that. If you're anyway serious about your career, you should be allowed to just manage your own drinking in the same way you're allowed to manage your own food.
Yeah,
like,
you're expecting that much off. No, if you Jack, if you listen to read,
but I do wonder. Like, for instance, would Jack O'Connor have said, "Look, watch your diet. If you have a bar of chocolate here and there, it's not the end of the world if it helps you relax." I mean, you could make the same. It's an analogy for.
I love
2 or
Jackie
3
Terrell's one
pints.
last year, which was he echoes my own thing and said he puts the chocolate upstairs so he won't go up for it.
Okay, that's a good idea.
That was one way of getting around it.
Yeah.
But the other argument about Dublin and the dilution of Dublin is that, you know, these things are cyclical anyway, right?
Yeah.
The great argument is, you know, Kerry completely dominated the 1980s and nobody ever thought that was ever going to end, and so forth. And, you know, we are seeing it in other situations like Real Madrid.
Yeah.
Apparently can't win a match anymore.
Yeah.
Where once they couldn't even
lose.
draw one.
I'll come to that in 1 second, just because people might be wondering what's this Dublin debate you mentioned. It's on page 10-11 of the Sunday Independent. It's Colm O'Rourke on one side, it's Robbie Kelleher on the other.
Yeah.
It's O'Rourke says yes, Kelleher says no. Interestingly, like, O'Rourke's point on splitting Dublin is nothing to do with their dominance, funny enough. Like, he would argue that the O2 Strategic Review Committee, which advised strongly splitting Dublin, was at a time when Dublin were not dominating. Far from it. They had won one Leinster in the 5 years between 2000 and 2004, so they weren't dominating at all. The O'Rourke argument is just about population, and that actually there should be more than one team servicing that size of population,
because there's loads of people not getting to fulfil their potential, if you like, and that was, and he's right. That I remember I covered it. I remember having to read every single page of it, and there was a lot of pages in it of the 2002 strategic review, where it was suggested that perhaps in the future this might be a solution to making sure that more people in Dublin fulfil their potential. That's what Colm O'Rourke is saying. He's not saying it for competitive reasons. He's saying that's my reason for saying there must be so many great players in Dublin who don't get to play for their county, and so. But Robbie Kelleher's on the other side presents a lot of very good hard facts and figures to it. I don't know, did you read them? But he's making the point about population explosions, and he's pointing out that in Kildare and Meath, their populations have increased by so much in the last few years, and yet the standard, they're struggling to compete, particularly in Leinster.
Yeah.
And he's also pointing out that the population of Mayo declined in the 5 years from 2011 to 2016, and yet, you know, they have been so competitive and competed in 4 All-Ireland finals and lost to Dublin on 2 occasions in replays.
Yeah, that's the argument. It's not so much why are Dublin so strong, but why is everybody else so weak? You know, it's very interesting, that whole dynamic. You can see it obviously in football as well. That it literally seems unimaginable now to say Manchester United were so dominant, and yet it's a few years now since they've won the league, and even just like decisions. That suddenly, if one bad decision, suddenly a bunch of others, like if you'd make a list, say, of players Manchester United have signed, right? Say like Falcao, even Martial, now Mkhitaryan, Shaw, Di Maria, all of whom you thought they are now going to rule for 1,000 years if you put them all together, and all of them in some way have been inadequate or haven't lived up to that. And it's almost like when something starts, it doesn't stop. Do you know what I mean? It's not like you make one bad decision and then the next one is okay. That a syndrome seems to kind of take hold. And I imagine it's something like this, that maybe for some reason the Dubs will start doing things wrong and they won't stop. Because it happens. It really happens. It happens in other sports at the very top level when, again, people are getting paid £500,000 a week. For some reason, they can't sign good players anymore. They just pick the wrong ones. Liverpool have been doing it for 20 years until about 2 years ago. They stopped signing bad players all the time. A virtuous circle can kind of be as unstoppable as a vicious one.
Momentum is momentum.
Robbie Keller's piece as well worth reading, like lots of statistics, as I said in there, about population explosions outside of Dublin, and yet their footballing standards have gone down. So I think people would be interested in reading that.
Well, I remember Ewan McKenna had written about this around the time of the All-Ireland final, and I was slightly surprised to see the point. Pat Gilroy made the point as well in the Sunday Business Post around that time. He was saying,
he did a big interview.
Everyone says you have 1 million people up in Dublin, so like, how could you lose? And he's like, well, I did go to lots of club games, and I'd say, oh, geez, I like the look of him. And it's like, well, he's from Longford, because people from other counties obviously live in Dublin. And from memory, but I'm pretty sure I'm right, the GAA playing population in Dublin, the number of senior registered players was about 39,000. Like Cork was at 33,000.
Yeah, and you're right, because Cork have so many clubs as well too. They're massive amount of clubs.
It wasn't incomparable. It wasn't a multiple of other counties by any means.
Yeah.
Brolly holds Dublin up as a kind of just example, even in their work-life balance piece.
Well, there was a really interesting. Sorry for Captain Crossy, but there was a really interesting piece yesterday in the Irish Times. Actually, Malachy Clerkin and Eamon O'Donoghue did a piece, and they looked at where players live and how many counties are affected by the fact that their players, but this time of year now, because we've got students, and where they're based. And actually, Mayo have 11 players living outside Mayo. They were saying Dublin Football and Galway Hurlers, which is interesting. Galway Hurlers had only one player based outside the county last year, and Dublin potentially Jack McCaffrey may move this year with his medical work. But otherwise, they were saying that the other counties, you've so many people travelling constantly on the move, and they did a map and they have all the figures in it. And I just think it links in actually really well with that.
Totally,
point.
yeah. I mean, because Dr. Ed Collin, who worked with Mayo before, was on talking about Mayo, how for the first 6 months of the year, it's just a grind. Yeah. And then, because they put on a bus, which goes up and down from Dublin twice a week, and you're getting home.
Roscommon bought a bus, and they've abandoned the bus now, apparently. Yeah, they taxied them. Right. They have taxied them on occasions up and down.
I remember from memory, Ed Collin was saying, it was just a case, get to summer and you get a lot of the students back home and they're sleeping well and they're not travelling, and you get a lot of the teachers home. But Brolly was saying of Dublin, because Mark O'Shea touches on this point as well, and it's maybe one point to finish on the GA, but so he says of Dublin, they only start the training in mid-April. Until then, they cycle, swim, do Pilates, etc. in their own time. This is for the championship. I think they take a 5-week break between league and championship. Training involves just 2 collective pitch sessions a week. On top of that, they do Pilates, yoga, etc. S&C programs. As a result, they're fresh, they enjoy their football, and critically, they have time to work on their skills. This is apparent from the way they play, and talked about Brian Cullen going in and having that role. That almost is a bit like, there's an analogy with boxing where a fighter really goes into camp and does kind of 9 hard weeks or whatever, as opposed to whereas Mark O'Shea, for instance, is talking about this month being a month of drudgery, players talking out in miserable conditions and matches which means nothing. And he says there are teams like Tyrone who treat the pre-season with such earnest that Mickey Hart is close to fielding his strongest team in January, and yet when they need to be on the tip of their toes, they were flat against Dublin in August last year. So it's hard to know.
With all of these things, it's very, applying too much logic to it may not be the way either. I mean, I live in Wicklow, which has this ferocious club scene, reading the Wicklow People, you read of wondrous battles,
ultra competitive is the euphemism, I think.
Ultra competitive, right? Huge enthusiasm. You go through villages and they got flags out and all this kind of stuff. Yeah. None of which gets up to the county team for some bizarre reason. I don't know why. I mean, there is no really sensible reason.
I always think when you look what Jim McGuinness did with Donegal, I always think, how is it so Dublin might have 40 odd players which are of a great standard, but it's of no use to them because the way the championship is structured, it's not a league format where, if there was 38 games over the year, the best team would win. But this is like a Champions League situation. Liverpool won the Champions League. As much as we love Jimmy Traore, you would even admit they weren't the best team. So I wonder,
I would admit nothing of the sort.
But I do wonder how come more counties don't do a Donegal and just get 20 lads, 15 to 20. Like every county has at least 10,000 players.
Yeah.
Just get the 15 or 20 best. Train right, prepare right, have a good tactical plan, and give it a go. I'm not saying they'll dominate
You sound like
for a decade.
a guru in
Well,
the making
but-
here,
but-
Joe.
but-
I'm not saying they'll dominate
But
for a
Joe,
decade.
but there's a couple of things you need there. You have to get the players who are good enough.
Yeah.
You have to get the players that are committed enough, and you have to get a quality coach on board. That's the miracle tree. And whether it's the Premiership and you're buying them, or whether it's you're talking about the GA, like that's the basic thing.
I just don't feel that's a miracle tree. Is my point.
But it does seem to be. I'm just actually have that Irish Times article with me, and I'm just looking at, and you're talking about Donegal. What amazed me about Donegal was, like, if people know Donegal, the size of Donegal, for players who live in the Inishowen to come to training, to centralised training in Donegal. I mean, they have to come across horrendous roads, and if you talk to Donegal players,
like Hannibal,
literally,
Hannibal
but it is much more difficult to get groups together in some counties than it is in others. And the statistics on that one were, for some counties, these are players playing away, right? Roscommon have 27 of their early season panel based outside the county. Monaghan have 25 in Dublin and 1 in Belfast. Louth have 22 in Dublin, but that's no hardship up and down the motorway. Donegal have 14 players based in Dublin, and to get them up and down is just impossible.
Horrific,
so
yeah.
they don't. They actually abandon midweek training during the early season stuff, and they only probably do when students come home.
Now look, if me and Declan were to go in as Wicklow's new management team,
Yeah, team.
Right.
Yeah.
I think, and I'd go up the ladder in the press box, and although I think it's improved since, and cover it.
You can come in as director of football. We can oversee this thing. But okay, so they can't travel up during the week. You send one S&C coach down to work with them, or you hire somebody in Dublin. Like, it's probably manageable if you're smart and fair with the players. I mean, you wouldn't drag the Donegal lads up during the week. That makes total sense. But you can train them down in Dublin if there's enough
and
of
that's
them.
what happens. That's what happens in a lot of places.
I don't know. I just I'm always surprised that given the format of the championship, which is potentially 5 or 6 games, such a short that we don't seem Wicklow having a great year.
It's ridiculous. Like, I didn't even
Carlo
mention
had
the
a great
hurling,
year last
right?
year, in
It's
fairness.
called the hurling they played in. They're wildly enthusiastic hurlers in Wicklow.
It's obviously more difficult than I'm presuming, because otherwise we'd see it more and more. But
well, I think also that there is that thing of the difference between comparing it to professional sports like rugby and soccer now is they all have full-time jobs.
Sure.
And that's the difference as well. There isn't the recovery rates, there isn't anything. They can't go home and go to bed after a heavy session. They're gone to work in the mornings, they're up and down. So it's complicated. There's no doubt it's complicated.
Yeah. So a few final pieces briefly, because we'll touch on the Gerben Grobler story. But Nick Harris in the Mail just has spoken to, I suppose, a whistleblower who was part of the Australian bid committee for the 2022 World Cup, which has gone to Qatar, who's written a book, and Nick Harris is just detailing some of the juicier stuff. I don't know. This ain't going to take down FIFA, this book. This is, I didn't think it was overly explosive.
Particularly when an awful lot of the quotes come from the source of
Sepp Blatter.
Sepp Blatter, exactly. Yeah.
But fascinatingly, Christopher Steele, the former MI6 intelligence officer who alleged serious misconduct and conspiracy between Donald Trump's presidential election campaign in Russia, was behind the collapse of Sepp Blatter's FIFA, according to this. Steele introduced investigative journalist Andrew Jennings to the FBI in the summer of 2010, leading to arrests and charges of racketeering, wire fraud and corruption in the game. So old Steele, right, that would be quite a double, wouldn't it? The head of FIFA and the president of the United States.
Yeah.
He's useful chap.
One of the funnier moments is when Blatter remembers phoning President Obama.
It's bizarre, isn't it?
A few nights before the vote to say, look, you're not going to win this. And the author of the book, Benita Mercedes, says, what did President Obama say? And Blatter said, he understood what had gone on. He thanked me for telling him.
My favourite image of all that time was the popular belief.
He said soccer.
That Putin was too humiliated by the thought of his certain defeat to come to wherever it was,
come to the meeting,
Geneva or wherever, But it was considered to be a signal that he simply couldn't show up to be kind of publicly humiliated in this way.
Yeah. The book says that in the months before the vote in December 2010, FIFA executives were privately worried that a Qatar win would leave a financial shortfall for the coffers in 2022. Broadcaster Al Jazeera, now beIN Sports, agreed a secret deal to pay $100 million if Qatar won the vote. The broadcaster did not dispute the allegation and characterised it as production contributions that are standard.
Production contributions. That's a great phrase.
But I think we all believe somewhere in our hearts that the World Cup won't be held in Qatar. In the hearts of all people, there is this strange belief that they simply can't do that.
I kind of like you. Yeah, I'm like,
oh God, no.
They couldn't possibly do this.
Oh, I've cleared my December for 2022. I think it's nailed. There's no way back now.
Oh yeah,
it's like Brexit. They'll find a way around it.
I don't know. I think we'll all be sitting here in 2022 December watching it for sure. Yeah. I can't see any way back.
Oh, we'll be watching it, all right. I mean, there's no doubt about that. But we won't want to be doing that.
We won't be out there roasting watching it.
Yeah, well, a lot of this is all, I think, out there already. So one of the stories is about the French aspect of the vote. When did Platini tell you his votes had shifted? He told him his votes were shifting. They all went to Qatar after the meeting with Sarkozy. So somebody from Qatar met with Sarkozy. Platini was reported to have met with the then French President Sarkozy on November 23rd, 2010, 9 days before the vote. Also at the meeting was Sheikh Tamim of Qatar, who would later...
Football men all.
Yes, who would later become the Emir. In 2011... Coincidentally, Qatar Airways purchased 90 aircraft at the annual Dubai Air Show. 88 of them were French manufactured. And Al Jazeera subsequently purchased TV rights to the French Ligue 1. And then Qatar Sports bought Paris Saint-Germain. None of that is connected.
None of it.
I want to emphasise none of that is connected.
And I wonder, how do they find rooms big enough for those egos to all fit in there together? It's incredible.
Meanwhile, Kevin De Bruyne is rubbing along at 150 grand a week.
Scandalous. Gurban Grobler.
Yeah, the one that caught my eye was Shane Horgan. Now, look, this story has been done to death, and we've all, me included, probably got into a state of righteous indignation during the week, and there was a lot of sanctimonious stuff going on. But I do think that Shane Horgan actually captures something that's been missed, maybe, really, in that, and I think somebody else pointed out today as well, this thing of maybe in Ireland we just have a different culture and a different attitude to sport. And perhaps it's because of our size and the fact that everybody knows everybody. So if there's ever a scandal in Ireland, we're all talking about it. And he makes the point. He says maybe it's a legacy of the Michelle Smith scandal, which darkened the country 20 years ago. That in Ireland, any kind of controversy is, parsed and analysed, by everybody over the dinner table, because we're so small and word gets around so quickly. And he has a very good phrase here. He said, fans turned into sceptics and sports journalists into activists. The IRFU should have anticipated the adverse reaction that Grobler's arrival would bring. And I think that's probably quite a good summary of a lot of the brouhaha that went on during the week. And I admit I probably contributed to it myself as well. Because I do think there is an attitude here about, doping really, besmirching the nature of sports, whatever they are.
Yeah.
People feel seriously about it, I think, here.
I mean, Donncha O'Callaghan wrote yesterday in the Times and wondered where was the compassion. I mean, he certainly said it was a mistake to sign him. Where's the compassion for this guy and how horrible the last 10 days would be? And Munster themselves held him up as a big deterrent. And look at the treatment of Grobler, and it's a big deterrent. And I accept that. I'd say he's had a dreadful 10 days. But if the media at large hadn't kicked up here over the last 10 days, there would have been very little deterrent. Really, like official rugby circles took him back in after he served his ban. So the deterrent was simply a 2-year ban, which everybody seems to agree is not very much. So I think it was right it was brought up and the questions were asked. Like Shane Horgan's piece is very strong. He says, would I be happy sharing a dressing room with the player with Grobler's history? The answer is no. And I don't think I'd be alone. In fact, he says, would you be comfortable in your workplace knowing a colleague had once tried to cheat his way to the top while you and the rest of your team had played fair? And then he raised a lot of the points which have been raised all week and don't necessarily need to be re-emphasised. But
and we should mention probably Neil Francis has a big piece about it today as well.
Just read one more quote from Morgan, which I thought was a fair point. I've some sympathy for a player who lost his way. Unfortunately, it's more complex than that. Though it's not his fault, his 2-year ban for steroid use was insufficient. It's not long enough to act as a deterrent. After all, Richie McCaw chose to take a sabbatical of just over a year to extend his career to good effect. Moreover, I can't believe that within the 24-month period, the benefits from steroid use would have disappeared from Grobler's body. With wage inflation, A 2-year ban mid-career could become an acceptable risk in the eyes of a potential cheat. And that's the scary precipice for rugby. If a 2-year ban for your first offence was seen as an acceptable
And in athletics, it's 4 years
risk.
now. And World Rugby should be changing that. And that's not Grobler's fault. That's an issue with the administration as well.
World Rugby are free to change it to 4, are they?
Well,
Athletics
did it. You know, you could do it if you feel it's warranted. You could do it. I thought. Neil Francis has spoken about it before.
But he'd written about Grobler 2 years ago.
Yeah, and he has a very extensive piece today. And he echoes something that I feel strongly about, which is, I've never heard anybody come out and say they were a doper who wasn't caught. They only ever say they've done it, or they deny it. Some people deny it, and then it eventually turns out, actually it happened. But I've never seen somebody voluntarily put their hand up and say, do you remember when I won that medal a few years ago? I was a doper.
I've seen the light.
Yeah, I've never seen that. I've never seen that. And Neil Francis says exactly the same thing today. And that's, I think, what comes back to my mind, because I remember when an Irish athlete was caught a few years ago, and they could have gone to the Olympics, and I remember thinking, how would they have thought when they were on that plane to the Olympics, thinking, I'm sitting on this plane, would it even have crossed their mind thinking, I've kept somebody else out of this team because I cheated? And that's, I think, what it comes back to me, like that honesty, that's such an integral part of sport.
But it depends on the dynamic of it, though. I mean, to what extent? I mean, like rugby officially is in a state of like great denial about there being a culture of doping generally in rugby. Which,
geographically, there's an argument in some places.
Yeah, I think there's a huge argument everywhere, frankly. And like by the evidence of one's own eyes, a different species is now playing the game than used to play it. I mean, that's unarguable, right? Now that may all be due to they're eating better and all that, and maybe it is. But I always find when you're talking about individuals, being done for doping, it's never satisfactory to me, and it never seems kind of right to be labelling them cheats or whatever. There's a culture that a lot of people are trying to kind of keep out of the way, or trying to. It distracts in a way from the broader culture of the thing, and we find that in a lot of other sports, this is what happens. That there's a sense that dopers are popping up here, there, and finally they all say, well, there's a culture of it, and it just grinds along very slowly, and then eventually you look back and think, oh yeah, that was obvious, wasn't it?
Yeah,
athletics being the most obvious example.
Frano at certain points gives his take on what he feels has gone on in Irish rugby over the last number of years. You can check out what he says. That's on page 2. He does, though, at one point say of the Grobler story, and this is the point he made 2 years ago. And I think like these are fair questions, and it's not to vilify anyone, but of Grobler, he says a lot of steroids can be ingested orally, but drostanolone is typically injected. A 5-week cycle is standard. So he said, my question 2 years ago was, where did he get the gear? And more importantly, who advised him on how to inject a potentially lethal substance into his body, the right dose, how to load up the syringe, where to inject? Most guys that age can't tie their own shoelaces. Where did the help come from? Why weren't all the franchise management team brought into the inquiry? Why did he plead guilty, no contest, hands in the air? Most dopers never fess up, even if the evidence is conclusive. He wonders, did he take a bullet for someone? Go on, sorry.
But yet you interviewed the
Del
Fava this week, and he said, no, I was a lone wolf. I did it all on my own. And I mean, you can go online. You can, you can go on to YouTube and get any number. I don't agree with Frano at all there. Okay. And I think it's the easiest thing in the world for an 18-year-old to go online and find everything he wants about how to dope.
Well, his point after that, the scary one, would suggest it might be. He says, in 2016, 12 schoolboys under the age of 18 tested positive for anabolic steroids. So 12. Now, the scary thing is, that's out of a random test of just 54 players. And 12 were positive. Schoolboys under 18. That's nearly a quarter.
That's a bit of a culture there, isn't it?
Well, he says that, and there does seem to be the result, the testing and the results of the testing do seem to implicate that there is a culture of it. But you had somebody on this week saying, no, even though I was caught, I was a lone wolf, it isn't a culture. I was a complete lone wolf. And I think the interesting thing for me on the Grobler incident, and I know we're singling out one person for this, but for me, the big question is an ethical question: is if Munster signed a guy who had a doping background, did they talk to him beforehand? Did they ask him to talk to their young players? Did they do that educational, work with their players? Was he used as, a poster boy to say, don't ever think about this. This is a terrible thing to do. But because Munster have never told us any of this, we don't know.
Yeah. And I suppose, look, the point over the last 10 days was about Irish rugby. It wasn't so much about Grosvenor.
Yeah, absolutely. That's what I'm saying. And that's Shane Horgan's point. It's about the culture in Ireland, about sport in Ireland, about how we feel about things, and that there is a very strong anti-doping feeling, I think, in the Irish public.
Where I have a lot of sympathy for him and this notion whether he should play or not play for Munster is like he would have signed a contract in good faith.
Yeah, if he signed, he signed.
Like you signed me, I presume you can't just change your minds. In some respects, I mean, you could argue maybe they've seen the light, but in some respects, if they suddenly cast him aside now, pay up his contract, don't play him, it's just as cynical. It's just like it's a very cynical move. It's like, okay, look, we can't really do it. We would have done it, but we can't now.
But as Declan
very
says,
torn on that.
if he went to France, if he played in South Africa, I believe if he went to Australia or went to New Zealand rugby, I don't think those same questions, that whole furore wouldn't have happened.
As intensely as here.
As intensely as here, yeah, for a load of different reasons.
Will we just finish in Tommy Bowe then? Because it's actually a very, very good piece.
Yeah, there's two nice rugby features, we like a nice read. Dennis Walsh has a lovely one with Reece Marshall in the Sunday Times, really good.
What's the gist?
He's really interesting. He was a farmer and he was out in this, he was never had a future in rugby at all, and he went on this sort of very small group of people who went on this unbelievably tough farming academy, and how he, dipping sheep and how you do it. And it's just a really good read. It's well worth a read.
And how did he get into rugby, or how did all that suddenly happen for him?
He was playing recreational rugby, and he was a good schools player, and one day he was invited for a New Zealand under-20 trials. But it's very good, and he talks about shearing sheep and how you do not want to pick a fight with a sheep when you're shearing. It's well worth a read, actually, very interesting, because it's all about his time out there, not about his time with Munster, but it's how he was really a late bloomer, and his background is interesting. And then the Tommy Bowe one is in the Independent? It's in the Sunday Times.
Peter O'Reilly.
Peter O'Reilly in the Sunday Times.
Page
yeah,
12.
Exactly. Yeah. Obviously his call time and his international career. I always think it's a bit weird when people do that mid-season. I just think sometimes you would think what happened at the end of the season. And he talks about why he wants to go out in his own way, but it's particularly good on how he could have missed out on the World Cup in 2015. That's worth reading. He came back from his honeymoon and he was very out of shape, and he talks about doing those suicide runs, and you get the impression that some of the training, I mean, even for him, was
gone mad.
Just vicious.
He was on his honeymoon in the Maldives, and so he says the runs they make you do, I don't know if you've done this recently, Declan, but it's a 150 metre shuttle sprint at the end of training. So basically you sprint a length and a half of the pitch, and then you jog back to a certain line as your recovery, and then you go again.
At the end of training?
Yeah. So he said...
you'd have to get to the beginning of training first.
He said, I'd done a few of these on the beach in the Maldives, dodging past all these honeymooners, setting up their tripods to get photos. But I might have done 3 and then taken a break, and then a couple more, maybe. In Carton House, Jason Cowman tells us we're doing 10 150s back to back. Ah, Jesus Christ, no, says Tommy.
Say that in a Monaghan accent even better.
At 3, I'm thinking, okay, I've done this in my holidays. At 4, I'm struggling. 5, I'm wondering, is the World Cup worth it? They put cones a bit further out for the locks and further still for the props. That's your recovery time, to give them a head start. Soon Joe was putting out a cone beyond that, specifically for me. And everything's on video. It's embarrassing. Mike Ross was beating me. You're just gone. In a huddle when it was all over, they were holding me up. I got sick walking back to the room. He made the squad though in the end.
He did make the squad, yeah, back. Exactly. And it's a nice piece. And
he's very
actually
likeable.
Interesting, he talks about, like, I don't know, I saw him, actually I thought I was double seeing things a few weeks ago when I saw him on a travel programme in Ibiza, but he is interested in working in rugby, in TV, but not as an analyst. He says he doesn't think he'd be up to that, but he clearly would like to be, maybe talk about rugby presenting.